Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of This Week in Paleontology. My name is James Napoli. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences.
Hi, I'm Dalton Meyer. I'm a graduate student at the Yale Peabody Museum.
And hi, I'm Alex Rubenstall, and I'm a graduate student at the Yale Peabody Museum, apparently.
Hello, my name is Amelia Zietlow. I'm a PhD candidate at the American Museum of Natural History.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Johnston. I am the vertebrate paleontology technician and preparator at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology.
And together, we're the Skeleton Crew.
Not to be confused with the Star Wars show that's coming out in like a few months that has the exact same name.
Well, we'll get a little boost to our viewership from that, I think. So this week, we're going to talk about a couple of papers that came out. Before we get into the papers we want to discuss this week, I think we would be remiss to not mention a developing story in vertebrate paleontology concerning the Tanis locality in North Dakota that has been interpreted as representing a rock layer deposited during the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. The specific allegation is that paleontologist Robert De Palma falsified data in his paper describing the impact site and is specifically determining that the impact occurred during the springtime, with the allegation specifically being that the data were falsified so that his paper could see publication before a competing paper by other members of the team. The accusation was specifically made by a PhD student at the University of Uppsala named Melanie During, who was a collaborator with De Palma working on the Tanis site. Now, Melanie's team had found evidence that the end Cretaceous impact event occurred during the springtime, and she was writing a manuscript about her research for publication in a high-impact journal. She'd contacted Mr. De Palma to ask if he wanted to join her paper. He declined, and then while her paper was still in the review process, his own manuscript appeared, which came to the same conclusions using a different line of evidence, and effectively scooped her paper, meaning that he was able to get credit for a discovery that she was already in the process of publishing on. There are numerous irregularities with the paper as published, including the fact that the graphs appear to have been hand-drawn, that no primary data was made available with the paper, and that the journal that this paper was published in requires the primary data to be made available upon publication of the manuscript, which means it's unclear how the paper was allowed to go through publication without that data being available to reviewers and now to the general audience. Mr. De Palma has said that the reason that the data are not available is that they were supplied as analog data, not digital data, and that the lab used to generate those data has now shut down because one of the collaborators on the paper passed away. It's worth noting in this case that scientific misconduct is not being wrong about something in a scientific paper. The scientific process exists to continually correct errors, and we expect that errors will be found in almost any piece of published research and that they get corrected at a later date. Misconduct in this case specifically refers to the allegation that Mr. De Palma falsified data for his publication, or that the primary data do not exist at all. It's also worth noting that scooping in a scientific context refers only to when a paper comes out saying the same conclusion as what you had prior to your opportunity to publish your own research. It does not necessarily need to mean that scientific misconduct took place. It's not uncommon for two people to come to the same conclusion using differing lines of evidence and unknowingly be in a race to publish that conclusion first. Here, the allegation is being made because De Palma specifically did not want to be part of Melanie's study, published his own study during that time period that came to the same conclusions as hers after he was aware of what her conclusions were, and has numerous irregularities. And that's why after months of trying to contact Mr. De Palma, Melanie and her PhD advisor went public with their allegations. It's worth noting that to clear his name on this front, all Mr. De Palma needs to do is produce his original primary data so that other scientists can verify that it is accurate and not fabricated. If Mr. De Palma is able to clear his name on this front, we will remove this part of the video to not contribute to any defamation regarding the case.
Alrighty, so I'll be talking about the first paper for this week, which is Paleopathological Evidence for Intraspecific Combat in Ankylosaurid Dinosaurs by Arber et al. So this paper is focused on ankylosaurs, which are a group of ornithischian dinosaurs, so a group that includes Triceratops and pachycephalosaurs, other primarily herbivorous dinosaurs. Specifically, ankylosaurs are thyreophorans, so their cousins are the stegosaurs. So in this paper, the question that they're trying to answer is what ankylosaurs use their tail clubs for. You might be wondering, why is that a question? Like, obviously, that looks like a weapon, right? The reason it's a question is because, as for all extinct animals, we cannot observe behavior. So we really can't see what the animals are doing with a particular structure. And the shape of a structure can only tell us so much. And so it makes it even more difficult for figuring out what ankylosaurs use their tail clubs for, is that we don't have any animals alive today that have a structure anywhere near similar to the giant tail clubs that some of the ankylosaurs had. So some ankylosaurs had tail clubs, some did not. And that's also why, it becomes a question. Why do some have it? Why don't others have it? So the two primary hypotheses that this paper proposes is that either the tail club could be used for predator defense, so swinging it at tyrannosaur legs, basically, or perhaps they were actually using the structure as a form of intraspecific display or combat. So intraspecific is within species. So very good example of intraspecific combat is deer, that the males lock antlers during breeding season to show off for the ladies. So the neat thing about the ankylosaur tail clubs that this paper points out is that they're relatively elaborate. They're covered in lots of bumps and lumps and spikes and ridges and knobs. And in extant herbivores that have very elaborate, showy weapons, these weapons are typically not used as actual defense. They're actually used for intraspecific display or combat. So the other thing that actually the authors point out about extant herbivores is that combat against predators is actually not a common form of defense. They either typically run away or try to avoid predators altogether. But it's very rare that an herbivore will actually stand its ground and fight a predator in the way that you often see ankylosaurs in media being depicted, standing their ground, taking a swing at a tyrannosaur or what have you. So how did they go about testing this question? Like I mentioned before, they've proposed two hypotheses for what ankylosaur tail clubs were used for. The first is that they're for possibly sexual display, and they tested that hypothesis by looking for evidence of ritual behavior. So this would mean there would be damage in the same spot consistently. So if you recall a couple years ago, I don't know, time is fake. A little bit ago, there was a paper published on facial biting in tyrannosaurs, and that was also ritual behavior. So ritual behavior is when the animals position themselves in the same place, in the same way. If it's combat, they're attacking each other on the same spot of the body each time. And typically the spot that they're attacking each other on is specific in both, or in that it's typically it's a spot that they're not actually going to kill each other, because that's not beneficial to either party. And obviously with evolution going forward, if you die, your genes don't get passed on. So an example with the tyrannosaur paper is actually a lot of the bite marks are localized in the front of the face away from the air sacs, because if they were to puncture the air sacs, they'd have a really bad day. So for the ankylosaurs, the authors would be looking for damage in areas of the body that are heavily protected and where strikes are less likely to severely injure or kill the animal. And the other thing that they tested for is allometry of the tail club. So allometry is when different parts of the body grow at different rates. So if this was a sexually selected feature, we would expect that it would grow at a different rate relative to the rest of the body. The rest of the body we would expect to just grow steadily as the animals matured, versus if it's a sexually selected characteristic, we would expect that growth in that feature would increase dramatically when the animal hits sexual maturity. So in this case, the tail clubs we would see an increase in the rate of tail club growth relative to the rest of the animal as they mature. So for testing the second hypothesis, which is defense against predators, they looked for correlation between club size and predator size. in the various ecosystems and various types of ankylosaurs. And I believe they also looked for correlation between club size through time. So, because as time went on, the predators got larger. So tyrannosaurs being a good example of this. The earlier ones are relatively small. The later ones, like T-Rex, are absolutely massive. Moving on, the star specimen of this paper is Zuul crurivistator. Zuul is a nearly complete skeleton of an ankylosaur dinosaur from the Campanian, about 75 million years old. It was found in the Judith River Formation, the Coal Ridge member, in north-central Montana. Zuul is pretty darn cool because it's nearly complete in terms of like the skeleton. We've got the head, the body, the tail, and then it also has skin impressions, which is, again, pretty unique. And so what's cool about Zuul, one of the many things that's cool about Zuul, is that it has damaged osteoderms. So osteoderms are the big spiky chunks of bone that are embedded in the skin in the backs of ankylosaurs. And some of them have damage on them. Not only do they have damage, but the damage is localized. So it's in the same spots of the body on either side of the body. And it is statistically localized to that region of the body. So that is interpreted as the authors as evidence of ritual behavior because it is localized, so it's happening in the same spot every single time. And I say every single time because there's also evidence that the osteoderms have been damaged at several different instances. So some of them are at different states of healing, and they can tell that because some of them are because the osteoderms in life are covered in keratin, which is what makes your fingernails and your hair. And as actually, if you think of modern cows actually have keratin covering their horns. So if you see a cow skull, the horns on the skull are smaller than the horns would have been in life because the keratin would be covering them. Same thing for the ankylosaur osteoderms. So because these osteoderms are at different states of healing, it means that they were injured at different points in time. So this is likely a repeated occurrence, them being damaged. So the other detail about the location of the damage on Zuul is that it's very well within the reach of another ankylosaur's tail. And I say well within the reach of because ankylosaur tails are very stiff. They're not very flexible, hence them being stiff. So they cannot bend around to the degree that a normal reptile tail can. And that's because they are locked up by ossified tendons. So ossified means turned to bone. So the tendons in the tail, which are normally a stretchy connective tissue, have actually become bone and they stiffen up the tail for most of its length. So they have a very limited range of motion. And this is also another piece of evidence against these structures being used as weapons against predators because they're not flexible. They can't move them around freely. And if they're being attacked by a predator, that's not, if your weapon is locked up, that's really not helping you. All right, so reviewing the evidence that the authors found for the tail clubs being a sexually selected structure, we've got that the damage is not random. It is in fact bilaterally symmetric, so it's the same on both sides of the animal, which is good evidence for this being a ritual behavior, that the damage is occurring in the same spot every time, and it's happening multiple times. They did not actually find any evidence of allometry, so they couldn't test that. However, in one kind of ankylosaur with a relatively good sample size called Panachosaurus, they found that the osteoderms, so the spiky bits in the skin, and the tail clubs themselves do not actually fully develop until the animals are older. So Panachosaurus, we actually have a pretty good sample as far as dinosaurs go, where we have juvenile individuals, subadults, and adults. And so the authors found that, again, the osteoderms are not fully ossified or turned to bone in the younger animals, and the clubs are only present in the older individuals. So that's, again, not quite allometry, but consistent with a structure that is developing as an animal hits sexual maturity. Therefore, assumed to be correlated with reaching sexual maturity, needing to display or participate in ritualized combat. And so they further evidence against the tail clubs not being used as weapons. They did not find any evidence of correlation between predators and the club size through time. However, they note that part of this could be due to a relatively poor sample size ankylosaurs are not super common fossils, especially in North America. And the other thing that the authors point out is that it's possible that the ankylosaurs early in their evolution just hit the maximum efficient size for this structure. So that is to say, if the tail club were to continue to increase in size throughout time as the predators continue to increase in size throughout time, eventually they would not be able to move their tails. Like, it would not be very efficient to have a tail club that weighs 1,000 pounds at the end of your tail. So there's constraint, a physical limitation on the club getting any bigger. So that's also a possible explanation for why there was no correlation between those features. And the other thing they point out is that, again, I kind of mentioned earlier, there's two kinds of ankylosaurs. There's the ankylosaurids, which have the tail clubs, and the nodosaurids, which don't. And nodosaurids were around for all the same time that the ankylosaurids were, and they never evolved tail clubs. So if this was a structure that the group had evolved to defend itself against predators, you would expect to find it in both lineages, and that is not the case. It's a good example of things are never as simple as they seem, right? So looking at that structure, it looks like a weapon, but actually, throwing some stats and science at it, turns out, nope. So yeah, that's the paper. What did y'all think of it?
So what I think is interesting is with the whole, this is specifically designed to take down gigantic predatory dinosaurs position that I've heard before for the tail club is, at least as far as I know of, one of, if not the only other group of heavily armored with huge tail club animals are the glyptodonts. And I don't know of any more recent South American horrifying, gigantic, bigger than the terror birds, like tyrannosaur-sized carnivorous animals.
Man,
So
that was the real monster all along.
Yeah, but I've definitely seen depictions of glyptodonts like Doedicerus using their tail clubs in intraspecific combat before, and also to take out the legs of Kalenk and things like that. So
Sure.
I find that interesting that they're probably using them for a similar thing.
Yeah.
So the other paper that we want to discuss that came out this week is a recent paper in Science Advances entitled Shifts in Food Webs and Niche Stability Shaped Survivorship and Extinction at the End of Cretaceous. This paper contributes to a long line of literature that discuss the idea that dinosaurs were already in decline prior to the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So the idea here that's been proposed a number of times in the last 30 years is that there's an observed loss of dinosaur diversity as you move between the two geologic intervals at the end of the Cretaceous. There's the Campanian stage and the Maastrichtian stage. The Maastrichtian stage is the final one in the Cretaceous that ends with the impact event. The Campanian is the most diverse interval in the dinosaur fossil record. We have more species from there than we have from most other geologic intervals in the entire Mesozoic. In fact, more dinosaur species from there than in most of the other intervals combined. Right? In Asia, the Campanian is mostly represented by the Jedakta Formation, which is where numerous perfectly articulated skeletons of things like Velociraptor and Pseudopody and Protoceratops have been discovered. In North America, it's dominated by a lot of geologic formations, but the main one is the Dinosaur Park Formation. This is exposed in Alberta, Canada, and it's, again, just an incredible font of diversity for dinosaurs. We keep discovering new species there. The fossil material is exceptional. It's long been noticed that as you move from the Campanian into the Maastrichtian, there's an apparent decline in dinosaur diversity. There are just fewer dinosaur species known. And that led to the idea that maybe the dinosaurs weren't completely knocked out by the extinction event. Maybe there was something going on in their environment that was causing them to go extinct already. And either they were doomed for extinction from the start and the impact only accelerated it, or a more moderated view in which the impact finished the dinosaurs off while they were weak. So a number of papers have done a back and forth on this recently. And in the interest of time, I'm absolutely not going to review all of them now. The end result is that it appears, based on work by the second author of this paper, Alessandro Chiarenza, who's a good friend of mine, that the dinosaurs were not in the process of going extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, and that the loss of apparent dinosaur diversity in the fossil record is mostly a function of a loss of area where dinosaur fossils could be formed. Which is true, right? We've got sea level changes going on. There's less area for dinosaurs to live in these depositional basins. So we just have less rock available to fossilize them in and to discover them in. And as a result, we find fewer dinosaur specimens, and therefore we find fewer dinosaur species. This paper builds on this conclusion and shows something very interesting. So what Alessandro shows is essentially the apparent signal in dinosaur diversity is probably a geological one. It's probably not reflecting a biological change. But this paper is interested in the question of, were dinosaur ecosystems actually more vulnerable at this time? And so that's where this paper comes in, looking at Mesozoic ecosystems and trying to see if they are more vulnerable for an extinction event at the time that the extinction occurred. And the end result here is based on some very, very detailed math combined with exceptional databases of fossil occurrences. It does not appear that they were. This is a very, very mathematically heavy paper, and it would be difficult and probably quite boring to go through. But their first figure here does a good job of showing exactly what happened, or what the analytical procedure was. So the authors downloaded dinosaur occurrence data from the Paleobiology database, which is a free-to-use database online of fossil occurrences. It's very, very helpful for a lot of studies like this. And then they critically combine that data with empirical data from fieldwork by some of the other authors. Because a lot of data takes a long time to make it into the Paleobiology database, they knew that wouldn't be a complete sample. And crucially, this also includes microfossil data. So they're not only looking at dinosaurs here, they're trying to look at all terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems in Western North America. So by including microfossils, things like teeth, things like small lizard and amphibian vertebrae, mammal teeth, things like that, you're starting to get a much more complete picture of what's in the ecosystem, right? Even if you don't know what species everything belongs to, you tend to know what's present. And so the fossils were categorized by ecological unit. The ecological interactions between the groups were determined by seeing where they co-occur and how strongly correlated the different ecological groups were with each other. And that gave them the ability to try to determine how interconnected the ecosystems were and whether there were any broad-scale structural changes going on in these ecosystems in the latest Cretaceous. So in panel C of this figure, we can observe that large predators are correlated positively and strongly with the presence of large herbivores. And that makes sense because that's their food source, and it's mirrored in the fossil occurrence dataset. So, very briefly summarizing this result, which I want to emphasize is a huge, long-standing project that's now been published, what we see is that there's not really a massive change in the interconnectedness of the ecosystems as you move from the Campanian to the Maastrichtian and then into the earliest phase of the Cenozoic. What does seem to happen is that large herbivores are de-emphasized as an ecological force in the latest Cretaceous. And that's mostly driven by a loss in their diversity that does seem to be to some degree a real pattern.
What do you mean by that?
So in the Campanian, there's a number of species of ceratopsian and hadrosaur that coexist in Western North America at the same time. Even though there's a lot of stratification in the dinosaur park and not everything in the dinosaur park formation lived at the same time, it is true that you see a greater diversity of those animals there than you do in the latest Cretaceous of Western North America. When in the Maastrichtian, you have pretty much only Edmontosaurus and Triceratops. Now, could that change with new fossil material? Absolutely. But it's worth noting that so far, that is the pattern that's emerged, and this is an area that is worked in a lot. These are animals that are biased in favor of discovery, right? They're very large, and we know the preservational biases favor large animals and their preservation and discovery in those environments. So it does seem fairly likely that there is a lower diversity in those ecosystems specifically that are preserved. There's probably more complicated things going on there. The fossil record is incomplete and very biased, and it's possible there's a lot of factors occurring. But it does remain the case that we don't really find other species other than Triceratops and Edmontosaurus in those rock layers. And so the authors suggest that it is possible that large herbivores in particular may have been undergoing some sort of a diversity crisis at this point, and that some sort of environmental change may have been making their ecosystems more homogeneous. But looking at the ecosystem as a whole, there's a tremendous amount of interconnectedness both before and after the extinction event. And it doesn't seem that the ecosystem is in any way at risk of collapse because the interconnectedness of the small-bodied animals that make up the base of the food web is still going very strong. So one of the other very important things that's going on here is that they find that the ecological importance of mammals is expanding throughout this time interval. And so the model that's often been proposed for the rise of mammals after the extinction of the dinosaurs is that there's a tremendous amount of empty space in the ecosystem. There's all these niches that aren't filled anymore. And that mammals are able to fill it opportunistically, right? They're just able to evolve with no constraint because there's no more dinosaurs to keep them in check. What this paper seems to be indicating is a more nuanced pattern in which mammals were actually beginning a tremendous ecological diversification already throughout the late Cretaceous, which means that they may have been primed to take over that ecospace from dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous, but also means that it's possible they were undergoing some sort of adaptive radiation and adaptive burst at that point that we'd never really recognized before. Which is very interesting if it's true, because it means we have no idea why mammals were suddenly becoming much more ecologically diverse at that time, prior to any space in the ecosystem being made for them. And so this paper makes a very important point about the way that ecosystems on land were changing at the end of the Cretaceous mass extinction, or at the end of the Cretaceous period, and in through the Cretaceous mass extinction, and once again shows that dinosaurs were not a group of animals doomed to extinction. They were very successful, with the exception of an apparent loss in large herbivore diversity. Their ecosystems were remaining very stable, or their ecosystems weren't remaining stable, they were changing, but they were remaining strong. And there's no evidence that there was any sort of environmental change occurring at this point that was driving them inexorably toward extinction.
What I think is really interesting and kind of timely in this year is that their kind of conclusion, or at least their suggestion of what mammals are doing, that kind of mammals maybe didn't succeed in the aftermath of the extinction just because they were there, but because they had a pre-existing leg up because of something that was happening to them before, is in line with a paper that came out earlier this year on reptiles. So earlier this year, there was a paper by Tiago Simoes and colleagues that was looking at the evolution of reptiles across the Permo-Triassic extinction, which is the extinction at the start of the Mesozoic that begins it. So it goes from the Permian in the Paleozoic to the Triassic in the Mesozoic, and it's the worst mass extinction in the history of Earth. And reptiles do decently well across it. And whereas in the Permian, early mammal relatives were kind of the top dogs and were the kind of essentially the dinosaurs at the time in terms of the ecological function they were fulfilling. They were the large terrestrial tetrapods. Reptiles emerge in the aftermath of that extinction and radiate, and you get like all the weirdness that everyone now expects to see in the Triassic coming out of these reptiles. And by looking at the rates of evolution in reptiles leading up to the Permian Triassic extinction and then across it, it seems that at least certain groups of reptiles, like the archosaurs, so things more closely related to birds and crocodiles, had, for some reason, elevated rates of evolution before the extinction event, while things related to lizards and tuataras, lepidosaurs, had depressed rates of evolution, but because they were small, they were kind of pre-built to survive extinction events, essentially. And so reptiles essentially had like two strategies that kind of, I don't love the word pre-adapted, but that essentially pre-adapted them to then be able to radiate into the Triassic. And so if something similar is happening in mammals at the Mesozoic, I think it's an interesting pattern.
Maybe primed them?
Yeah, primed is, I think, a better term.
I mean, I always talk about the biases in the fossil record. And this paper, this paper does a tremendous amount of work to justify the fact that the patterns they're showing are not bias. Mm-hmm. They acknowledge that bias could play a role and could change some of the specific trends they observe, but that overall they've brought so much data to the table and they've done so many sensitivity analyses that they find that their result is robust. That's this paper. It's a very exciting piece of research.
Yeah, the antlers on deer, they're only grown during the mating season. They are explicitly and only intended for mating.
Scott, calm down. Jesus Christ, Scott! It's only a tail club.
He's gonna blow. He's gonna zool.
Scott's.
It's zoolin time. That was my favorite part of the paper, is when it said it's zoolin time.
But like, oh my.
So
Yeah, like dear.
Well, we got a
Andrew,
stinger.